About the author. When I finished writing my book entitled The Unseen Hand, and was preparing it for publication, I decided that I would add a brief page describing a little about me and the reasons that I had written it. I felt that it would assist the reader in understanding my material if I included some brief comments about my personal background. I have become an avid reader since my graduation from college, and I have noticed that many of the works I read frequently failed to provide some of this background information. So I feel that I must include similar information in this, my second book. I started reading in 1963 when a friend of mine noticed that even though I was a college graduate, my knowledge of history, political science and economics was woefully lacking. I started reading at his insistence, and I haven't stopped since. Reading in one subject got me interested in another, and the process led me ultimately into the esoteric world of secret societies and their concealed symbols. The word esoteric is defined as a word or understanding that is intended for or understood by only a chosen few, as an inner group of disciples or initiates. As I continued my reading, I started noticing that I was discovering the evidence of an enormous truth. A truth that had escaped almost all of yesterday's historians. There was no question that some of these researchers had been moved to expose a part of this truth. But I was unable to find the one book that would put the entire story all together. My search for that elusive volume continued, but I simply couldn't find it. About a year ago, I started feeling the need to write that volume myself. However, feeling extremely inadequate for a task as important as this one, I decided that I would redouble my efforts to locate the one volume that would put it all together into one easily understood text. I continued my search into the writings of others, hoping to find someone who had performed this task before me, but I continued to be unsuccessful. Since I was unable to find that one book, I decided that I had to write it myself. This is that effort. So, please accept this modest work for what it is. An honest attempt to put 26 years of research into one volume, by an individual who feels completely inadequate for the task. I can assure the reader that my self-perceived inadequacy is only because of the importance of the information discovered. The chore seems to be doubly difficult. Not only must my research be thorough, but I must also make the information I have uncovered believable. However, I do feel that I have succeeded as far as my meager talents have allowed me. There is no question that the research I conducted was not as exhaustive as it could have been. The more that I read, the more that I realized I had to read, because the evidence to support the conclusions of this book appeared to be nearly limitless. However, there comes a time when every researcher must conclude that the material that has been already located is adequate enough to convince even the most ardent skeptic, and that any additional material uncovered would only duplicate that which had already been found. In addition, there are several things I would like the reader to know. Quite often I have quoted the comments of several writers when one or two would probably have made my point. However, there is a reason for this. My intention is to make certain that the skeptical reader could not claim that I had cited only one writer and that he or she could not speak for the others in his or her field. I wanted the reader to know that there were several authors who made the same point with their writings. In other words, I have endeavored to truly document my conclusions by exposing the reader to as many writers as possible. I believe that the reasons I have endeavored to do this will become clear as the reader progresses through this book. Secondly, the authors that I have quoted were either those that I discovered had a part in the events described in this book, or were those who had convinced me that they had personally researched the original works of the authors they cited. In other words, I am attempting to prove my contentions from the writings of those who were either directly involved or have thoroughly documented their own research. The reader will soon discover that the writers I have cited are many of the principal writers in the area of this volume. The reason that I have done this is simply because I believe that the information that I have uncovered is extremely important to the future of the world, and that it must be presented in a manner that is as believable as is possible. I WNT the reader to believe this information because it comes from the experts in their respective areas of expertise. I also, and lastly, I would like the reader to understand that I have attempted to keep my comments and/or opinions to a minimum in this book. I believe that the evidence that I will present stands on its own and should be adequate to convince even the most ardent skeptic. It will need little if any explanation from me. In summary, then, I am hopeful that the reader will agree with me that I have succeeded in exposing a monumental truth that has escaped the overwhelming majority of the historians of the past. I am convinced that the average reader will find it difficult to accept the conclusions in this book. However, that does not mean that the evidence is incorrect. It merely indicates that most people will consider those conclusions to be simply too incredible to be believed. But, because of the implications for the future of not only the United States but of the world, if I am correct, it is imperative that this material be considered by as many as is possible. For this reason, I have attempted to keep the contents of this book as readable as I could. I am hopeful that each reader will be as dutiful as the average jury member. Anyone who has served on a jury will remember being admonished by the judge to remain open as they consider the evidence to be presented throughout the trial. The juror is instructed to ignore any previous prejudices and to carefully weigh the evidence presented. I can ask no more. My goal is to have a positive impact on reversing the plans of those who are altering our future. Obviously, to accomplish that task, I must convince as many as I can that I am correct in my assertions. I am therefore hopeful that each reader of this material will accept my challenge and remember the admonition of the judge. Be honestly open and dutifully consider the evidence that will presented.